When the Criminal Proceeds Recovery Act was introduced in 2009, it was firmly targeted at gangs and drugs. It says police don't need a conviction to seize assets that criminals can't prove were paid for legitimately.
4 V-Rod Harleys, 3 Range Rover Sports and a Rolls Royce. Now these are really significant assets. They're status symbols that a gang would choose to use as a sphere of influence to entice younger people to join that gang.
The motorbikes were seized alongside nearly $3 million worth of property, which has been forfeited to the Crown as a result of this operation.
Triple J accumulated assets exceeding $2 million, all while reporting a modest annual income of only $35,000 to Inland Revenue Department.
In essence, if these groups choose to deal drugs, and we're talking Class A, we're talking meth and other drugs like that, the reality is that they're causing incredibly immeasurable harm into our communities.
The proceeds are upwards of $80 million a year. When the Act was amended last year to draw in an estimated $25 million more, the then Justice Minister's news release talked about organised crime and making it harder for gangs and their leaders to benefit financially. But now, a twist. I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, how a law that was designed to be wielded against patch-wearing, drug-dealing organised criminals is being used to target a cartage company guilty of health and safety breaches and its old-school boss.
I see someone sitting in a car and they were just yelling at me to open the gates. And I'm like, well, who are you? And it was like, well, it's the police. And I had to say, if you've got the right house... And I read the warrant and it was for the proceeds of crime, and I'm like, what?
Well, we stand to lose our own house, our children's house down the road, which is in our family trust, our batch, which we've had for 17 years over in Waiheke, plus a whole Salters operation. You know, a lifetime of work. I ended up with 4.5 months home detention and a $400,000 fine. I think it was about $120,000 in reparation, which has been paid. And I did my time. I thought I'd done everything, and it was all over. Why are they trying me twice, and trying my family?
That's Ron Salter, owner of Salter's Cartage. The New Zealand Herald's investigative reporter David Fisher's been following his story that started with a workplace death in 2015. And now involves the restraining of $11 million of his assets accumulated over the 40 years Salters has been in business.
Ron Salter's an old school type businessman, and he's old school in the sense that he built this business out of one truck that he drove himself. He still runs that business, works at that business 6 days a week, a lot of the time.
David interviewed him a day or two after an explosion that killed Ron's employee, Jamie Lee Bowring.
A man killed at a massive explosion from a fuel tank at a factory in South Auckland was apparently welding on top of the silo just minutes before it blew up. The explosion at Salter's Cartage in Wiri happened just after 1:30 this afternoon and was heard at least 5 kilometres away.
I heard one absolute earth-shattering explosion.
The best way to describe it was a shockwave. It was almost like an earthquake that came through the air, and it almost blew out our front door.
I stepped down, had a look, and one of his humongous big oil storage tanks is no longer there. There's nothing there. There's just a singed ladder sticking up in the air. The rest of it's just non-existent. It just went boom and everything's gone.
The police confirmed a contractor has been killed at the scene, and WorkSafe New Zealand is investigating.
Now, the thing about Salters Cartage is what they cart is waste fuel. So they collect old diesel, petrol, kerosene. They store avgas. They've got all sorts of types of fuel, and they bring it in from all over the country, and they store it there, and they recycle it there, and it gets used again. So September 15 in 2015, Jamie Bowring was working on a catwalk on top of a 96,000 litre fuel silo. And that fuel silo was meant to contain one particular type of fuel that would have had quite a high ignition point. As it turned out, it contained a melange of different types of fuel. There was about 3,000 litres of petrol, kerosene and oil. And so 3,000 litres in a 96,000 litre silo, all the rest of it was fumes. And terribly, when Jamie was welding, he ignited those fumes and he died as a result. His body came to rest in a car yard that was over the road from Salters Cartage, some distance away from the silo.
I remember that event. It was pretty horrific. And afterwards, Ron Salter got in trouble, didn't he?
Yeah, so police began the investigation of Ron Salter initially, and that investigation and then prosecution was taken over by WorkSafe. And that led to, in 2017, Ron Salter pleading guilty and the company pleading guilty to 6 criminal charges laid under the hazardous substances or health and safety legislation. And as a result of that, there were fines to pay and reparation. All of that added up to about $450,000, $500,000. And Ron Salter, with his guilty plea, he received a home detention sentence of about 4.5, 5 months. One of the things that was striking about the guilty plea, and this matters when you get into the police case and the police proceed to crime case, is that one of the offences to which Ron Salter pleaded guilty was to do with offending after the explosion. And so what had happened then is that in the wake of Jamie Lee Bowring being killed, WorkSafe needed to inspect the site. When they inspected the site, they found a number of deficiencies and they barred it from operating for a period of time. Within that period of time, Ron Salter opened up and operated the business in a way that he wasn't meant to. And so when it came to the sentencing, the judge really leaned on that to say, not only did you create this terrible health and safety situation, but then you exacerbated it by going back and ignoring WorkSafe's rulings. The judge had called it, he said it was hard to imagine a more flagrant breach of prohibition notice. And he said that in the context of Jamie Lee Bowring's death, it lifted the assessment of culpability to make it a case of high culpability.
So this wasn't just a case of him ignoring a mourning period. This was a case of him breaking the rules again to go back in there and keep working.
That's correct, yeah. And the history that Salters Cartage had with health and safety authorities is quite telling there too, because the flag had been raised with them in 2011 that they weren't compliant. The flag had been raised again in 2015 that they weren't compliant. There's questions to be answered by the authority as to what they were doing in the 4 years in between, why they didn't go back and say, hey, you need to fix this, why haven't you done that? But the questions really were greater for Salter, which he was told there were problems, there were deficiencies. And then in that period of non-compliance was this terrible 2015 incident.
So these health and safety breaches weren't just a matter of you haven't filled in the right form. They were genuinely life-endangering situations.
Yeah, they were very, very significant. And perhaps to give an indication of how serious it could have been, that silo that blew up with the welding that Jamie Bowring was doing, not far from that was a silo of a similar size that was filled with avgas, and the level of catastrophe that would have come about as a result of a more serious accident there is hard to comprehend.
In terms of blowing a hole in Auckland?
That's right. When I think of if everything there had have gone on that day, that fire would probably still be burning.
Wow. Okay, so these weren't minor things, but he did plead guilty and he paid his fine and he did his time. And then what happened?
So in 2019, the Salter whānau became aware that police were carrying out fresh inquiries. And then Ron Salter and his wife Natalie told me about this in February 2020.
There were whispers that we were under investigation, and it was like, well, I didn't know what for. Ron had done everything.
You know, half a dozen cars turn up with all these policemen. I'm going, what are you guys looking for? In the fullness of time, you'll find out, Mr. Salter. That was their stock answer for everything. I got a phone call from a lawyer saying, do you know what this is about? And I go, what are you talking about? And he said, there's restraining orders against all your properties.
the investigation that police have been doing was into proceeds of crime. And that really gave me a bit of a double take, because proceeds of crime legislation is something that I had always associated with organised crime offending or serious drug offending. It was one of Parliament's responses around the time of the rise of methamphetamine.
Yeah, it was sort of in response to anger, wasn't it, that all these druggies were making a fortune, buying their Harley Davidsons and their gang houses, serving their time, getting out and still being rich.
That's right. There was a notorious case where a headhunter had been standing trial for, I think it was drug-related offending, and through the course of it, he was quizzed about the mansion that he lived in, the motorcycles that he rode, and the expensive cars that he drove around in. And he was asked, "Well, how do you make this money then?" And he told the High Court, without a smirk or a smile, he made it through goat semen because he bred goats. And that was such a thumb of the nose at the process and the law that that started a conversation about how do we claw back this money? How do we make them prove that they earned the money legally and lawfully?
And the legislation was kind of widely applauded, wasn't it? Because it just seemed so just.
It was a really interesting thing. It has been a really interesting thing for me to go back and read all of the speeches in Hansard around this, because both sides of the House are agreeing. There's sort of it's not long after Helen Clark's government was replaced by John Key's government, but speaker after speaker is getting up and almost falling over themselves to talk about how much they agree with the previous speaker from the other party, and even more than they agree with me. It's almost quite funny to see how wholly it was taken up. And the speeches, they do have a real indignation to them that you can have organised crime figures that can make fortunes out of terrible misdeeds and not have to explain themselves. And so this legislation was about creating a format through which they had to explain the fortunes that they had. And it created three hurdles for police pursuing proceeds of crime. First, it had to be serious criminal offending, and that was identified by the number of years in prison that one would have to serve, which was, I think it was a 5-year prison sentence. The other trigger, and that's what's significant in the Salters Cartridge case, is that it was offending that involved $30,000 or more. And so if whatever people had done, and this was very much within thinking about gangs and gang crime, as long as what they had done involved X number of years in prison, cooking methamphetamine or dealing methamphetamine would have done that, or $30,000, and again, methamphetamine business, that's chump change, you had to prove that the money that you had was lawfully yours. The police could compel you to do that.
So that was an either or, not an and.
No, that's an either or.
And that worked really well. And the police have made a mint out of it, haven't they?
It's an extraordinary amount of money.
So the Salters properties were restrained. They couldn't sell the business and they couldn't expand either because the police action meant banks wouldn't lend them any money. And lawyers aren't cheap. Salter has well-known KC Ron Mansfield on the case. Now the Court of Appeals ruled that the police must underwrite the case against the Salters. In other words, if the case fails, the police must pay the Salters for any losses they incur.
To me, it's an interesting thing because where we've got to in this case, almost 5 years down the track from the assets being initially restrained, is a case that judges have described in almost every judgment that's been released on this, the police action as being novel or unusual, or I don't think they've got as far as using the term creative, but that's kind of the vibe that you get from it. When you read the original Hansard, it's hard to match that up with health and safety offending.
Yeah, it must have come from left field for the Salters.
Certainly the impression I've had from Ron Salter is that he believed he'd served his time. certainly when I interviewed him in 2017 after his guilty pleas, he had no regrets at all about pleading guilty and bringing closure to it at that point. I think since the assets were restrained, he's had a number of occasions in which he's thought twice about whether those guilty pleas were the right thing.
But there's another twist in the tale. The death of Jamie Lee Bowring was not the first that Ron Salter admitted responsibility for.
So during the course of the inquiries that I was making, I came across, and this was in the High Court file in the police bundle of documents, reference to previous convictions that Ron Salter had. One of those was a careless driving causing death conviction from 1987, and that was something for which he received 6 months periodic detention and an 18-month driving ban. Now, he had prior to that other convictions for driving, and this is in the context of him having a trucking business that ships waste oil, that he'd operated a vehicle carelessly or inconsiderately. So there were 3 convictions around that. There was another conviction that's from the 70s and 80s, another conviction in 91 for inconsiderate driving, and then a drunk driving conviction from 2008.
Do you think this adds up to a kind of like an idea of entitlement from Ron Salter?
Well, one of the people that I've spoken to throughout the course of this business, particularly through the proceeds of crime case over the last 4 or 5 years, is Sarah Ferguson, who's Jamie Lee Bowring's mother. And one of the things that she talks about when she considers this information coming out and Ron Salter going back and operating the business when WorkSafe had said that he wasn't allowed to, is that feeling of entitlement. She finds it particularly distressing and destabilising to consider that the thing that had happened that took the life of her child, that those events in one form or another had occurred before, and that after that, Ron Salter had carried on doing what he was doing in a way that breached health and safety best practice. And so when I'd mentioned earlier that there was a lot of pain and a lot of upsets in the Salter family, it's certainly not only that whānau that is experiencing that distress. Sarah Ferguson's been in a state of terrible upset, as any parent would be, since she lost her son in September 2015.
It's now 2 years on. How are you coping without Jamie?
Struggle every day. Every day is a struggle. He was my world, and just struggle. It's hard getting up every morning. I haven't slept a full night for over 2 years. I struggle with everything. He was a real character, and he lit up a room when he came in. You know, it was just terrible. It's undescribable. It's like you're screaming internally every day, just wanting him so bad, you feel like your heart's going to explode.
Ron Salter has spoken to the Herald about his anguish over the fatal incident. Do you, in the light of all this information, believe that's genuine?
Ron Salter sat with me in 2015 and 2017 and sobbed as he talked about what had happened at his workplace. I have talked to him about the loss of life that occurred and the impact that has had on Jamie Lee Bowring's family and on the Salter family, and looked into his eyes as he's spoken to that. There was no mistaking the anguish that he was wrestling with.
Do you think he's just so old school and kind of bullheaded that he doesn't see the point in health and safety regulations and the connection between this potential loss of life?
My sense of it is that waste oil is a little bit like the septic tank man. It's a grubby business that nobody else wants to do. And I think because of that, there hadn't been quite the level of visibility that there may have been on other types of businesses. And I think partly because of that, Salter has just got on and done things the way that he feels that they need doing. And having done it for so long without there being an incident such as that, which happened in 2015, he probably did feel like he knew where the give was and how to avoid that.
So what are the chances of the police winning this case? And how do they prove that the gains Salter has made over the last 40 years is all the result of his health and safety breaches?
When it comes to the eventual High Court case over this, I think there's going to be a lot of argument over how much profit is related to offending. It wouldn't surprise me that with police making a pitch to the court that they would aim for the highest end that they possibly could. In the same way that it's no particular surprise to me that the Salters have gone for the lowest end that they could possibly argue, which is zero. Mm-hmm. That's why there's going to be 7 weeks of High Court action in October this year.
This is a real test case, isn't it?
This is where it gets really gnarly, because Health and Safety Act and Hazardous Substances Act, they're the same sorts of legislation that a business has to wrestle with as, say, the Resource Management Act or the Fair Trading Act or the Tax Administration Act or the Financial Markets Conduct Act. There's a whole swathe of different laws that businesses interact with on a daily basis. It'd be really easy to find, if you were inclined to, $30,000 or more worth of offending to do with the Fair Trading Act or the Resource Management Act. Dairy farms exceed $30,000 of business on any given day, really. And they deal with the Resource Management Act all the time. So were the case against the Salters to be proved, then it would leave, I would think, many different businesses feeling extremely vulnerable, because they could very much be the next one under the gun. The thing to consider here is that what happened at Salters Cartage in 2015 was particularly egregious, and it happened in circumstances where Salters was out of step with health and safety and hazardous substances provisions, and had been for quite some time, and then having been out of step and facing a bar to carrying on its work there, went back and did it anyway. So I know from talking to business owners that they feel a real degree of vulnerability around this, but it would surprise me if we got to a point where police were taking pot shots for proceeds of crime at anyone that tripped and stumbled.
Do you think this is overreach on the part of the cops?
I think that the police have a good argument. It was serious criminal offending, and we know that because a young man died, and died in circumstances that were completely preventable. I've worked on a number of health and safety related cases over the years, and they're terrible, terrible cases. Nobody goes to work to die. And so I think that the police do have a good argument to make here. I also think, though, that there's something very compelling about Rod Salter's argument, which is, I've served my time. And that's something that has quite a bit of resonance with people as well, that he fronted up, he admitted what he'd done, and he paid out $9.5 million in fines and reparations, and did 4.5 months home detention. So that's something that has a lot of resonance with people, as I've found.
That's all for today. Thanks to David Fisher. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Veal and produced by Gwen McClure. I'm Alexia Russell. Matua.